Hello, so welcome to day 4. So congratulations, you've made so much progress. So we've done day 1, 2, 3, and today we are on day 4. So today I want to go through a few quick things. I want to introduce 2 new concepts today. One is earn percent, and the second one is stalemate. And then we'll talk about how you win the game of chess. So we'll review how to check the king. We'll talk about creating checkmates. We'll review some simple checkmating strategies. Okay. All right, so let's get started. Let me just share my screen here and then we can start. Okay. All right, so one of the first things I want to do today is to review 2 new concepts in chess. But before I do that, I want you to understand the purpose of the game of chess. The purpose is to checkmate the king, right? And so if you're playing with the white pieces, you want to checkmate the black king. If you're playing with the black pieces, you want to checkmate the white king. So that's the whole purpose of chess. And let me start by illustrating the form of checkmate, right? So if you're playing with the white pieces, there is an opportunity to create a checkmate in 4 moves. And this is very common because most players fall into this trap where white checkmates the king in 4 moves. So it's a position where white starts with the pawn to e4, a very common opening. As I mentioned in earlier classes, it's always better to start with the pawns in the middle, either the pawn in front of your king or the pawn in front of your queen. So in this position, white starts with the pawn in the middle, and it's very common for black to respond with the same pawn in the middle. Right, so in this case, we have e4 and black plays e5. So white continues by developing the bishop on an active square, putting pressure on this weak f7 pawn. So in chess, you'll notice it's always good to put targets on these pawns, right? Because these pawns are weak. The reason why this pawn is weak is because it's only defended by the king. It's the same thing here. It's only the king that defends this pawn, unlike other pawns on the chessboard, right? So this one, for example, is defended by a rook. This one is defended by a bishop. This one is defended by a queen and bishop. This one is defended by a queen. This one is defended by a bishop, and this pawn on a7 is defended by a rook. So these pawns here are weak because they're only defended by the king, and we know that the king can be vulnerable to attack as well. So in this position, hold on. So in this position, white develops the bishop, putting pressure on this pawn and creating an attack on the pawn. So it is common for black to continue developing a knight, right? Developing the knight towards the center, protecting this pawn and taking control of these 2 central squares. So in this position is white to play. So white plays an aggressive move, developing the queen, and now putting a double attack on this pawn. So we see the attack with the queen as well as the attack with the bishop. So if black is not careful, black can get checkmated in this position. So a very common mistake here is for black to continue with knight to f6. The assumption here is that black is playing a knight attacking the queen. But black is missing the point here that white will deliver a checkmate in 1 move. So this move, why this move attacks the queen, the move does not prevent an attack on this square. So here in this position, white can simply play and capture that pawn and create a checkmate. So this is a checkmate position now because the king has no safe square to move to. The king cannot come here because there's a queen in that position, right? The king cannot come to any of this square on the 7th rank because this queen protects all of this square. So the king cannot come here because this queen is there. The king cannot go there because there's a bishop on that square, and also the queen is covering the square. So this is a checkmate position. So the whole aim of chess is to get to a position like this where you checkmate your opponent's king. Now, when black is in check, there are a couple of options. There are actually 3 ways black can get out of check or checkmate position. So let me assume, let's say there was no pawn there, and now it is black to play, or white to play. So assuming this is the position and is white to play, and I just make a move like this, check, assuming I don't have a knight there, right? So white to play and I make a move like this. Now there are a number of ways black can get out of check in this position, because now I'm checking the king with my queen. And so how can black get out of check? Well, a couple of things. So black can either move to a safe square. That is one way to get out of check. Black can intercept the check by blocking, or black can capture the piece that is creating the check. So let's go through the options here that black has. So now white has just moved to h5, creating a check on the black king. So in this position, black can move to a safe square. So this square is safe because there is nothing attacking black in this position. So that's one way to get out of check. The other way for black to get out of check is to block, to intercept the square. In this case, black can push a pawn to g6, now blocking that square. So now white does no longer have a check on the king. So that's one way. So let's assume that black had a knight here. So white goes here and creates a check. We've gone through 2 options, right? So one, black can block. Black can move to a safe square. But the third option is that black can capture the piece that is creating the check. So in this case, black can use the knight to capture this queen that is creating the check. So black can simply play and capture the queen. Okay, so this is an important concept to review when you're playing chess, and to be aware of this form of checkmate that white can, often use to checkmate the black king, particularly if black is a new player. So let's review that again. So white will often start with e4, black replies with e5. Now, white can also continue by playing the queen first. All right, so by playing the queen, white is now putting pressure on that f7 pawn, but white is also attacking this pawn on e5. So this is an example of what we call a double attack. White plays a move and is attacking 2 positions, right? Attacking the pawn on f7, which is only protected by the king, and also attacking the pawn on e5. So in this position, because right now, white cannot create a checkmate, because if white takes, the king will simply take. So that pawn is protected, right? So in this position, white will not do that right now. But white can take this pawn right away because this pawn is not protected. So if it's black, since it's black to move, black can play a knight to first protect the pawn. So white can continue with the aggressive move here of bishop, again, creating a double attack on that square. So here, black has to be careful now, because if black is not careful, black will get into a checkmate. So in this position, to avoid the checkmates, what do you think black can do? So pawn to g6 is a good move to avoid the checkmates, because now you are intercepting the square for this queen to get to f7. If you simply make this move, remember this move attacks the queen but does not prevent the check. If you simply play this move, then white has a checkmate on that square. So you don't want to play that move. So this is a good way to protect and prevent the checkmate. But here, white can be sneaky as well. White can simply play the queen to f7, again, creating a double attack on the f7 pawn. So now, as a black player, you have to defend that checkmate. And a good way to do that is to play your knight to this square. Now you're blocking or intercepting the queen from getting to f7. Now the queen cannot take the knight because this knight is protected by the black queen. If I take the knight with my white queen, the black will just recapture my queen. Okay, so it's very important to pay attention to this. This is something that will be helpful when you're playing the game of chess. So now let's learn the two concepts I want to introduce. One is en passant. En passant is a special move, a special pawn move in chess that happens when you have a pawn on the 5th rank. So in this position that we have, white has a pawn on c5, and black just played a pawn to d5. Now you'll notice that we know that pawns capture sideways, but with en passant, because black played a pawn past the position that white can attack, in this case d6, white can now do the special pawn move called en passant and capture the pawn. So this is something that will only happen if there is a pawn on the 5th rank. So in this position, when black plays that pawn, white can now capture by moving the pawn to d6 and taking the pawn away from d5. Okay. All right, so this is another position that we can review. So in this position, black just played. So white had a pawn on c5 and on h5. But black just played the move from pawn to g5. So in this case, en passant only works immediately after the opponent's pawn move. So because this was not played right away, the d pawn was not played right away, white cannot capture en passant with the c pawn. So in this case, we can only capture en passant with the h pawn. So to do that, I'll take my pawn, put it on that square. I will remove this pawn from the board, and then black can now recapture my pawn on g6. So in this case, I'll make that move to go. This is the final example I want to review. So in this example, black just played. So white had a pawn on A6. White also had a pawn on C5. And black just moved the pawn from B7 to B5. So passant only works if your pawn is on the 5th rank. If you have a pawn on the 6th rank, you cannot use the pawn on the 6th rank to capture the pawn. So that's not how passant works. It only works with a pawn on the 5th rank. So in this case, I cannot capture with my A pawn. I can only capture with the pawn on C5. So in this case, I can capture passant C5. Okay, so this is the final example. So I have all these pawns. And so black just played a pawn to B5. And so I can capture that passant. Black plays another pawn here. Remember the rule, I can capture passant. Black plays another pawn here on C8, I can capture passant. And now if black plays that pawn again, I can also capture passant here with my pawn. Okay, so hopefully that idea is clear. So the next thing I want to review is stalemate. Stalemate in chess is a draw. And stalemate happens when black has no move to make. So for stalemate to happen, the king, your opponent's king, does not have to be in check. And your opponent's king will not have a move, a valid move to make. When that happens, we have a stalemate position. So in this position, if white plays the bishop from G5 to F3, now attacking all of these squares, and it's black to play, black has no move to make because it's going to be a draw. It's a draw because the black king cannot come to any of this square because the rook is controlling other square. The black king cannot come here and the black king cannot go there because the bishop is not covering that square. So when we move here, we've created a stalemate, and this is draw because black has no valid move to make. Okay, so let's look at another example of a stalemate. So stalemate again, remember, is a draw. It means the game is a draw. Black cannot move anywhere. There is no check when we have a stalemate. So in this case, it's white to play and to create a checkmate position. So first, let's look at this position and say, okay, right now, where can the king go to? The king can come to this square because right now this square is safe. The king can also come to this square. Those are the only valid moves black can play in this position. Right? The king cannot come to this square because this knight is covering that square. The king cannot come here because the knight is covering that square. The king cannot go there because there's a pawn behind the king. So in this position, we know the king only has two moves, which is this and this. So for us to create a stalemate position, we have to take those two squares away. And the best way to do that is to move the knight to that square. So this knight now covers those positions. And this again is stalemate because the king has no square to move to. Okay, so let's look at one more example. So again, we can create a stalemate here. So first, let's look at the black king. And so, okay, what are the moves the king can make or black can make in this position? We know black can move this pawn, either one square or two squares. We know right now in this position, black can move the king to that square. Black can also move the king to that square. Those are the only squares black can go. Black cannot come here. So those are the only two squares the king can move to. The king cannot come to this square because the square is protected by the bishop. The king cannot come here or here because those squares are covered by the rook. So in this position, we know black has the move, can move the pawn or can move to these two squares. So what move can we make as white to take away the possibility of black to move to these squares or to move this pawn? So if you look at the position correctly, you'll see that that move is knight to g6. Because knight to g6 prevents this pawn from moving, takes away these two squares. The bishop takes away the f7 square, and the rook takes away the d7 and the d8 square. And this is a draw because this is a stalemate. Okay. All right, so let's go through some positions about creating a check. As I mentioned, for you to win the game, you have to create a checkmate. And oftentimes, for you to create a checkmate, you first have to create a check. So you check the king, and then you follow up with a checkmate. So in this position is white to play. And here, white can create a check by moving the rook to e7, creating the check. Okay, so let's look at another example. So in this example, how can white create a check without losing the king, the queen? So here we have the king here. We have the knight protecting the king, because right now the knight is blocking the king and the white queen cannot get to the king. All right. So, but how do we create a check safely here with the white queen? So if we are playing the game, we can check the queen. If I have my queen here, I can check the king by moving my queen to the square. But if I do that, this knight can recapture my queen. Another way I can check the king is to move to this square. But if I do that, the knight can recapture my queen. So from this position, is there a way you can check the king without losing your queen? And yes, we can. So there is a position here where we can move our queen to the square, creating a check on the king. So if it's right to move here, we can play that move and create a check. So let's look at a few more examples. Here, let's create a check in one move again. So white to play to create a check. So we know we cannot create a check with our bishop because the king is on the opposite color, is on the dark color. I cannot create a check with my knight because if I move my knight to a white square, or there is no square, I can move my knight closely to attack the king. So here, the best way to create a check is to create a check with my pawn, because now I can use this pawn. This pawn, remember, I can move 2 squares. So I can move this pawn 2 squares to attack the king, and that will be a check. So if I play that, I create a check. So let's do one more example. So this is a difficult one, but how do I create a check here in this position? So here, remember where the king is, and see my queen is directly opposite the king, but it is being intercepted by this knight, the white knight. So if I can get my white knight away, then I can create a check. I can also create a check with my rook to this square, but if I do that, the knight here can recapture my rook. So then the best way for me to create a check here is to maybe move my knight to a square, creating a check on the king. Okay, so let's review something again. Out of check. How do you get out of check? Because you have to learn how to defend as well. If your opponent is creating a check, you have to escape the check. So in this position, the black queen is attacking the king on e1. And so for us to escape, we have to go to a safe square. So in this position, we can move to any of these safe squares, because this queen here is covering all of this square. So if it's white to move here, we can get out of check by simply moving away. Okay, so this is another example where the white king is under check by the black queen. So now we have to move to a safe square, right? So where can the king move to here? Can I go to this square? No. Why? Because this knight is covering that square. So that square is taken away. Can I go to this square? Again, if you look at the board, no, because again, that knight is covering that square. Can I come here? No, because again, the queen is still going to be attacking the king on that square. Can I move to this square? Again, if you look at it, no, because this bishop is covering that square and this diagonal. So I can't go there and I can't come to this square because of the bishop. Can I come to this square or that square? No, because this queen is covering those squares. Can I come to this square? Well, it looks like I can, because on that square, there is really nothing attacking me on that square. No black piece is covering that square. So in this position, the only move the king can make is to go to that square. All right, so let's look at another example here. So remember when I said if you're in check, there are a couple of things you can do. You can either capture the piece that is putting you in check, or you can intercept the square, or you can move your king to a safe square. So in this position, the white king is under check. Check from the black knight. So here, white has to look for a way to escape the check. So can the king move to any safe square? In this position, no, the king cannot move because it's all surrounded by its own pieces. So the king cannot make any move, cannot go to any safe square. So we don't have that option. So the other option is, can the king intercept the square? In this case, you cannot intercept a knight check because remember the knight is the only piece that can jump over others. Then now the only option we have is, okay, can I capture the knight, which is the piece that is putting the king under check? So in this case, we can, but how can we capture the knight? One way to capture the knight is to capture with a pawn. But can I do that? I can't in this case because this pawn is pinned by this queen. If I capture the knight with my pawn, then this queen is going to be attacking the king. So this in chess is an illegal move. So capturing this knight is going to be an illegal move because in chess, you cannot legally expose your king to an attack. So how else can I get rid of this knight? It turns out that, yes, I can actually capture that knight with my knight. And this will prevent or stop the check. So I can go ahead and capture and then stop that check. All right, so finally today, I want to review a few checkmates in one. So remember, the aim of chess is to checkmate the king. And you checkmate the king when the king has no safe square to run to. So in this position, is white to play. And this is what we've reviewed before, right? So in this position, we see that white has a double attack on this pawn. So the bishop is attacking that pawn on f7. The queen is also attacking that pawn on f7. And if I capture with my queen, I create a checkmate because the king has no safe square to run to. So once I capture, that will be a checkmate. So this is another example. How do I create a checkmate here? It's white to play and to create a checkmate. So in this position, you see that my queen is covering all of this square. So the king is trapped on the h file. So if I can get my rook to check the king, I can easily create a checkmate. Because if I check here with the rook, I'll be attacking the king, but the king can escape to h7. So in this position, white to play, I can create a checkmate by playing my rook to h8. Okay, so this is another position. This is checkmate in one move. How can white create a checkmate in one move? So again, we see like the king in this position actually has no safe square to go to. The king cannot go there because of this knight that is covering the square. The king cannot go there because of the knight that is covering the square. The king cannot go there because I have this bishop covering the square and I also have my rook covering that entire square. So I have to look for a move that just creates a checkmate right away in this position. This is a harder one to see because it's a concept called a discovered check. So if you look at my pawn here and you see my bishop will have access to check the king if I can get my pawn to move. So once I capture my pawn, take this pawn and capture this pawn here, I open an attack for my bishop to attack the king, and that will be a check that black cannot stop. And so that's going to be a checkmate in one. So when I capture that, I create a checkmate in one. So let me do one final example here. So in this position is black, white to play and create a checkmate in one move. So if we look at this position, what are the squares that the king can escape to right now? Well, the king can go to this square because that square is not under any threat. The king can also go to this square. The king can also go to this square. All right, so those are the three squares the king can go to from this position. So what move can I make to take all those squares away and attack the king and create a checkmate? So if you saw this move, my queen come into that square, then you got the answer because that will create a checkmate. Because my queen will take away all the squares and my queen will take away the square as well. So queen to e7 creates a checkmate. Okay, so one final thing I want to do is to walk you through how to checkmate, some basic checkmates with two rooks, with a queen, and perhaps with one rook. Because this is something that you can find in your game easily when you're playing the game of chess. So let's say I have two rooks on the board and I want to checkmate the king. The best way to create a checkmate with two rooks against the king, because it's possible to have this position when you're playing your game, and it's very common with beginners. Right, so to create a checkmate, one of the ideas when you have two rooks to create a checkmate is to continue to take away either the ranks or the files from the king. So you want to keep driving the king away until the king gets to the corner of the board. So in this position, I know the king is on this d8. And so what I would do is to look for a way to drive the king. I can have the king I can trap the king on the 8th rank by placing my rook on this file, on this rank, on the 7th rank. Once I place my rook on the 7th rank, I know the king will be trapped on the 8th rank. And all I have to do is to get my other rook to the 8th rank to create a checkmate. So in this position, one option, if it's me to play, white to play, I can play my rook to f7. And if black makes a mistake and plays to that square and goes to that square, I can now create a checkmate by playing my rook to b8. And now this is checkmate because the king cannot come to any of these squares and the rook is attacking the king on the 8th rank. Because now the king has no safe square to go to. Another option is I can drive the king all the way to the end of the board. So let's say the king was here. I can start by taking away the 6th. I can start by taking away the c file. So I can move my rook to the c file because I now know the king cannot come to any of the squares. So let's say the king moves here. On my next move, I can take away the d file by moving my rook to this file. Now the king cannot come backwards because of my rook. So now I'm going to force the king to continue to move towards the h file. So now I can force the king to move. And now I can now use this rook to take away the e file. So this is a check. The king again has to move. Let's say the king moves here. I can now check again to take away the f5. Let's say the king moves here. So now I have to be careful, because if I move my rook to g to take away the g5, the king can capture my rook. So now that I see that the king is attacking my rook, I can move my rook away so that my rook is not being attacked. And let's say the king goes here. I can now check to take away the g5 for the king to run away. But let's say the king, instead of going there, what if the king comes here? In this case, I cannot check here again, because if I do, then the king will just capture my rook. So what I'll do, I'll just move my rook all the way. So sorry, I have my rook here. I'll just move my rook all the way where the king cannot get to it easily. And now if the king makes a move, I can create a check there to take away the g5, because I know the king cannot come here since my rook covers all of the squares. So this will force the king to move, and then I can now create a checkmate. So this is how you checkmate with the two rooks. What if you have just one rook? How do you checkmate with one rook? But again, for you to checkmate with one rook, you need to have your king in the game, right? So in this case, let's say white has a king. Let me just put, assuming white has a king here and the rook here. So how do you checkmate the king in this position with only your king and your rook? So the idea is the same. We want to cut off the files and the ranks from the king, because to checkmate the king with only your king and your rook, we got to drive the king to the corner of the board, right? So we got to keep driving the king to the corner of the board, and essentially to one side of the board where we can now create a checkmate. So in this position, the best thing to do is to move my rook so that I can take away the 5th rank from the king. So the king cannot come to any of these squares, right? So now the king will be forced to move backwards or to stay on the 6th rank. Now if the king moves, I have to now start bringing my king closer. Let's say the king moves again, I have to take my king closer. If the king moves, I have to keep taking my king closer. If the king moves, I gotta move my rook. Let's say the king goes there, I gotta move my king. So what I want to do now is to get a position where if the king moves to this position, once I have a position where we are facing each other, right? So the king is directly in front of my king. Then I can create a check because I know I've taken away all the squares from the king. And so the king will have to move backwards. So now with a check, the king has no choice but to move backwards. And then I'll do the same thing again to move my king forward. If the king comes here again to oppose me, anytime I see the opposition, what do? I create a check, and the king will be forced to move away. Now, if I come here and I create a position, black may be forced to move, because black knows that if they come here, they're going to get checkmated. So now, because I want to create an opposition, I don't want to move my king, because I'm hoping that black will move the king in front of me. So what I can do is to just move my rook and wait to see if the king will move here. If the king moves there, this will be a checkmate because I've taken away the squares, and the rook has covered the 8th rank. But what if black does not come here? So what if black goes here? Fine, I'll continue to move my king because I now want to create a position. Because now if black comes here, I have the opposition and then I can checkmate. So in this case, black may go there. And again, I'll now create my queen. And now black has no option but to come here and then I'll create a checkmate. So this is how you checkmate with the king and rook. So the final lesson I want to share today is, okay, how do you checkmate with the king and queen? Again, it's going to be the same idea as the queen, as the king and rook. Again, you need your king to help. So let's say this king is here. So what I have to do is to continue to drive the black king all the way back so that I can checkmate. So in this case, I got to bring my king closer. If the king moves, I'll continue to close the gap. So now I'm taking away. Now I'm taking away the fourth rank. I'm also taking away the e5. So I'm gonna keep forcing the king to go back to the corner, and then I'll create a checkmate. So let's say the king moves here. Oh, sorry. So let's say the king moves to this square. Again, I'll just move my queen closer. Again, I'm taking away all these squares. I'm just boxing the king now into those squares. I'm also taking away these squares. All right. Let's say the king moves to this square. Again, I'm just going to move my queen here. So now I've taken away all of this. Now forcing the king to move to just any of those four squares. And if the king moves, again, I'll just continue to move my queen, taking away more and more squares. If the king moves, I do the same thing, taking away squares. If the king moves, so here you have to be careful not to create a stalemate. Remember we went through stalemate. Stalemate is a draw. So in this position, if I make a mistake and play my queen to b6, this is a stalemate because now the king has no safe square to move to. The king cannot come here and the king cannot go there because the squares have been taken away. So this is a stalemate position because now I've taken away all of these squares from the king and the king is not in check. So I'm not going to play in this position, I'm not going to play my queen. I'm just going to start bringing my king closer. And the king will just be moving between those two squares as I bring my king closer. And once the king goes there, I can now checkmate on that square. So this is what you should be watching out for in your game as you play your game, how to create checks, how to create a checkmate, and how to checkmate with the king and the queen, or the king and the rook, or with two rooks against the king. Okay, so we'll end the lesson here. You're going to have your assignments again to do for day 4, and we'll have one more day left, and the lessons will be over. All right, so bye. See you tomorrow.